this is me. There's not much to talk about here, I don't think, but I am a researcher and lecturer. My research revolves around safe sport. So I work at Victoria University. I was a college athlete. I played basketball, so that was my sport, but I also played volleyball, tennis, soccer. I did swimming, I did horse riding. I did a little bit of everything before my parents were like, you need to pick one or you're not going to play at another level. And I say college level a little bit cheekily because it was Division III, so it was really for the fun of it. There was no scholarship, there was nothing, but it was still hyper competitive. And I actually ended up dropping out my senior year, not of college, but off the team, which is very rare to do in a senior year of your college team. That's kind of like the pride and joy of your whole journey. But there were a lot of practices that I just didn't agree with. And we'll get into some of those today and talk through some of those things. But at the time, all I remembered was it just wasn't fun anymore. And even as a 21-year-old, that's all I remembered at the time. I did not think this is problematic, this is abusive, this is unsafe. I didn't think any of that. I just thought, this isn't fun anymore. Why am I doing this? Why am I waking up every morning to go there? So I think that's a message that we're kind of thinking about holistically throughout the day. If you haven't already, this is just a pre-survey. I'm a researcher by training. This is one of the first times something like this is being done in Australia. So as Tom said, we've been working on this for 4 months. We've built it around an evidence base, all around behavior change theory. It doesn't matter to you guys necessarily, but what does matter is this is the first time that we're really coming to the community and asking, what do you know? Where are you at? What do you need? Because there are so many resources coming out, I think, especially over on the mainland where people are reactive, saying, oh man, there's a problem in sport, we need to create an education module, we need to create this, and all the different organizations competing. There's not a lot of research on actually where community sport is at with this in terms of knowledge, what you need, what you know. I've been shocked. So far the workshops have blown me away with where people's thinking is at. Like, it's much farther than I think the general assumption is. But there are some gaps, and I think it's really important for us to understand that. So part of that takeaway is from this, and the data will be collapsed across everything. And a really important note is that at the end, so in 3 to 4 weeks' time, I'm giving myself a deadline. My goal is to collapse all the information across the 3 workshops, develop a resource bank as well for whatever you guys say is most needed, from my knowledge internationally, but also nationally around Australia, what's available, and bringing that back together and sending it out to you guys. So it'll go to any of the attendees, but then you can disseminate that out farther. Really important. We're not going to get into like really nitty-gritty case studies. We're not getting in depth into like hard case studies. We're talking about a lot of gray lines in sport. But we're all coming from different perspectives. Maybe we have experiences outside of sport that are less than ideal, and things can be triggering. So there's absolutely no judgment whatsoever if you need to take a moment and step outside. If you need to take a breath, drink a glass of water, write something down, something to ground yourself can also be really helpful. So I just always start with that, because if we're talking about things about safety, we need to talk about how we're taking care. Workshop goals. First, foster a positive environment. We want sport to be fun. We want it to be enjoyable. I told you about my negative experience in sport, but I love sport so much. I love it so much that I'm studying it for life. I went to school for, I think, 12 years in total studying sport. I love it. So how do we keep kind of fostering that positive environment? How do we balance the competition elements? Because we often think about competition being an elite sport driver. But to think it's not at the community level would just be ridiculous, and I think everyone would agree. And that line between where community sports starts and stops and elite sports starts and stops, super blurry to me. I mean, I've had people tell me, oh, well, you know, Talent Scout's kind of 5, 6 years old in gymnastics. So is that when elite sports starts? That's the complexity that we're dealing with, right? There's not an easy cutoff there. And we also want to make sure that everyone is prepared or ready to respond to instances of poor behavior when we see them. This is the part that I probably need to spend the least amount of time on, but it's important to note. There's a lot of context in sport, and when we look more broadly, we see a lot of situations that have come to light. Larry Nassar case, USA Gymnastics, Swimming Australia. They're just the sports of the moment that we're seeing out there. There's no specific trend that one sport is more challenged in this space than others. But there are a few reasons why we see these elements across sport. Historically, sport is of violent nature. It has a physicality to it, always has. I just came from Safe Sport International, which is the largest conference in the world on safe sport. So it had, I think, over 30 different countries there represented, all talking about their industry, their practices. And I led a research symposium as well there. And the important part is after that, I went to Athens for a break. And I went to the site of the Olympics, and they had a podium there. And I watched one by one as every single person walked quickly around the stadium and walked straight to the podium and stood on top of the podium. Very clearly not ever or not recently athletes, but everyone stopped to the top and did one of these poses because that's the idea we have, right? It's the Olympic dream. That's where sports started. The sport started with combative elements, evolved into that, and then we broke it down for training, and then we broke it down to community sport. So there's all these elements that are in it that innately drive this kind of winner-takes-all mentality in sport. And that's a driver all the way down. We know at elite sport, a lot of funding goes up there, and a very little amount comes down to community sport. And the stuff that does mostly focuses, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, anyone, mostly focuses on things like infrastructure and talent pathways to that elite level. So that's kind of the mentality that we're around, and that kind of ideal is pervasive across sport. And that's a challenge for us because that kind of hierarchical structure creates some challenges that we have to battle against when we want to create safe sport. I would say that the issues I'm talking about today aren't new. They're just ones that we're finally willing to talk about. And the way I conceptualize that is that I don't know if you guys have done this at all recently, but go back and watch the shows you watched 20 years ago now. Anyone done that recently? Because whoo, I was watching Friends, I think I was watching Frasier, we'll pretend I'm not as old as I'm saying I am. Watching these shows with my eyes now, and I'm like, oh, that's a bit off. That makes me feel uncomfortable. That's this, that's this. That's what we need to think about when we see poor behaviors in sport, right? When we look back 20 years ago, we're like, everyone normalized this, but that was the culture then. Doesn't make it right, but that's why everyone normalized it. But if you're feeling a bit funny about things happening now, or more importantly, if the next generation is, there's a reason for that and we should listen to it. And that's the biggest challenge. When we normalize things for so long, it's hard to kind of say, ooh, it feels wrong, or hear someone when they say that feels wrong. It's like, no, this is how it's always been, this is what it is, and that's what we have to kind of break down. And the other context is Australia is a hugely sporting nation. Oh my gosh. Like, US, we like our sport, college sport, absolutely, but I landed in Australia and within a week I was told that I needed a footy team. I promptly picked Collingwood because I really like the colors. It gets better for you. It gets better because I was very quickly made aware that everyone hated Collingwood. My university was Western Bulldogs affiliated, so I quickly pivoted, and it seems no one really has a strong opinion other than them, either way or the other with them. So that was safe. So that's where I'm at now. But you needed a team. That was the topic of every conversation. That's a challenge. That's a benefit. That's great. There are so many kids playing sport. 87% of kids in Tasmania between 4 and 14 playing a sport outside of school once a week. That's a huge number, massive number. School sports are quite different in the US, so it's a different context, but that's a massive number. And when we look at the Australian context, at least for this one is an example of girls, but boys are not that far off in terms of differences. The things that they love, the things that will make them drop out if they're not great, are not the things that we often think about. It's not competition. They want to enjoy it. They want to be social with their friends. They want friendly coaches. That's massive. And that goes across the boys too. Competition goes up a little higher with the boys, absolutely. That's historical, that's ingrained. There's a masculinity to sport that's always been there that drives that factor. But social and skill acquisition, absolutely up there. But I think one of the more interesting ones is this next one. This side is a new study that was released by the International Olympic Committee, and this is inclusive of boys and girls. It was a youth survey. It was asking them what their concerns were about doing physical activity or playing sport. So the question is, what if any of the following concerns prevent you from being more physically active or playing more sport or at all? And some of the top responses for this applies to me a lot or a bit or a lot, kind of the net combination of those two. This is the first time we've seen data like this. Kids saying they're worried about experiencing verbal and physical abuse in sport. I've never seen that before. Like, it's an assumption as a researcher that that's kind of out there, but the data hasn't been there, and that's at an international level actually with the youth population. I don't enjoy competing. Again, that's not everyone, and we're not saying competition is bad by any means, but it's saying that there is a group of the population that doesn't necessarily want that as the main driver, or that competition is kind of pushing things too far. There's a whole movement now that's happening as well around informal sport, driving sport around opportunities that don't require a competition, a practice competition mentality. So there's a movement there that might get a little bit of traction. I don't know, it's very early on in that stage. But it's important to kind of contextualize this. When we look at this data over here, again, this is looking at Australian sport, factors relating to the retention of women and girls. And again, boys, not that different, but it is interesting to look at women and girls, especially in the 13 to 17 year range. That's when we see a massive drop off in girls. There are a lot of things happening right there. We care a lot more about our social circles around that time. There are a lot of bodily changes that happens. There's also a lot greater experiences of abuse that happen around that age as well. So the things that come up for that group, 13 to 17, unfriendly coach becomes a major factor, not having fun, lost interest. And there's not data on the correlations between all those things yet. That's a place we want to go farther with the research, is actually linking that all together. But what we're seeing here is we have some information about what kids want. We have some information about what they don't want and why they're dropping out. And we have a major problem in Australia in getting kids to play sport and keeping them. So when we think about safe sport, I don't think it's really the add-on. I think it's the thing that we've got to do to get everything else right. If you don't get that baseline, the kids aren't going to come. If you don't get that right, they're not going to stay. So what makes sport safe? We need to consider things beyond just the physical environment. I think a lot of times we focus on infrastructure and safety of facilities and things like that. And there's more of a push, especially around the equity and access of facilities, equipment, concussion. That conversation is really only just starting. I think we have a long way to go there as well. Leave that one alone for a moment. If we want to come back to it, we absolutely can. But the emotional environment becomes just as important as the physical environment. And that's what we're going to hit on a lot today. I think we need to get to a point where efforts are praised regardless of performance. We're focused on the human first. We're not focused on performance. When we think about the holistic sample of the population, if you've got, 99.9% of people are never going to make it to the elite level. But 100% of everyone who's played sport is playing at the community level at some point. And we know that at any one time, quite a few kids are playing sport in Australia outside. So there's a need to think about that whole community, and not all of them need to push for competition, especially when we know that competitive environment can have some downsides depending on how it's driven forward. Children feel safe to speak up. I think this is a huge one. It's one of the biggest challenges more broadly in the field. Look at education, look at religious sectors. It's not just sport, but having an environment where people feel safe. A safe environment doesn't mean one that has no disclosures. A safe environment means there's a recency of disclosures. On average, it takes about 20 years for someone who has experienced child sexual abuse to ever report it. There's not much data on all the other types of abuse because no one's really focused on it yet. So we don't know how long it actually takes people to come forward with that. But what that's saying is right now, we're not going to hear about anything that's happening for another 20 years in most cases. Not all cases, but in most cases. So that's a challenge. We need to move that. We need to find all those people that are having those negative experiences earlier so we can combat it, so we can fix it, so we can create that safe space. And that's a massive challenge. An environment where well-being and safety is prioritized at all levels of sport. So not win at what cost, not win at all costs. We think about what does winning well mean? That's a new strategy. How do we actually deliver that at every level? And deliver it with meaning, where it's not just a slogan, but it's actually happening on the ground. All right, so this is an activity. I mentioned that we'll do a couple activities, and to me, these are the most important element of the workshop, is actually having you guys talk about things. So we're doing this in two ways. One, first, individually, you'll be able to go to the QR code. It'll take you to an online platform, and I'll pull that up so we can all look at it. What I want you to answer is there are two questions on that online platform. One is, does this scenario cross the line? The next question is why? I've presented this scenario at 2 universities to sport coaches internationally in the UK and in Belgium. Very varying opinions on this that I'm happy to share after we have our discussions. And I want you, after you've done that with your table, then look up at each other and talk about if you've ever seen a scenario like this. It doesn't have to be to this level, but have you ever seen anything like this? And what did that feel like? What were you able to do? Did you see anything happen? How did it unfold? What can we learn from it? So I'll just read out the scenario, but as I'm doing that, if you scan that, you'll open up to the Padlet, and then I'll be able to open it when I'm done. So I've had a gut full of you lot. This is a coach. You're just hopeless. How many times do I have to show you this drill? All you do is muck around. And you're the worst Jack. That bloody mobile phone rules your life. It is no wonder you let the team down week after week. You're hopeless. What are you smirking about, Daniel? You're just as bad. I come out here week in, week out with no bloody help or thanks from anyone. I don't know why I even bother. Not one of you is trying, not one. If you get beaten again on Saturday, I would serve you bloody well right. So that's your scenario. These scenarios are from Play by the Rules. They mimic real life scenarios that have unfolded. So I'm interested in your individual responses to the yes, no, if it crosses a line, and then the why. And then after that, look up at each other, and let's have just a quick conversation. It can be 5 minutes. And after that, I want to bring it all together. We'll all talk together, and I'll share with you what the coaching students thought, because I think that's quite important context as well. So the question is, does the scenario cross the line? If you just hit the plus button, you're already figuring it out. You can see why or why not. All right, amongst your group, maybe just have a conversation about unpacking that. Thinking on that, I only made it to a couple tables, so I'm going to promise to go to the other two, the next one. But some really interesting conversations. The tables I went to, most everyone had seen something like this unfold relatively recently, so not historical only, which is important to discuss. I think something that came up as well from at least the two tables that I was speaking to was around what drove the coach to get to this point and recognizing that fact too. It didn't make it okay to use this language, but I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. And it's an area that's actually quite important to me because I don't think the goal is to villainize parents or coaches at all. In fact, I think coaches and parents are stuck often in a system where above there's a message of competition and below the kids are actually pushing a message of competition, and you're sandwiched between those just trying to do your best and trying to sometimes herd cats, right? So at what point this, should they be able to regulate themselves? Of course, but we don't know what happened before this. We don't know if this instance is the third time this coach has tried. And a lot of people are reflecting that they've gotten to this point. There's a lot of research in the broader field to suggest that those who are abusive in their language or their behaviors now were in fact survivors of abuse themselves. So you're absolutely right. You go the opposite way or you lean into it. And in what we're talking about here is also intergenerational things. And that's why I'm saying we cannot blame parents and coaches just because they came up that way. We need to redirect the system. There needs to be support. There needs to be an understanding of why we don't do that. And that's the biggest challenge. There's still this mentality of, well, I had tough love. Kids need resilience. And that balance of drawing the line between giving them that structure and that resilience versus actually causing damage is really blurry. Less so in the literature, but I would say pretty blurry overall in the context that we work. The definition, so that last example absolutely counts as violence. It's abusive language, it's abusive behavior. It can absolutely have long-term consequences for the children depending on their context. You often think of one exposure maybe not being enough to really cause long-term damage. But remember, with any child walking in, they're coming from an environment outside of sport as well. You do not know what they've experienced. If they're coming from a domestic violence situation, if they've experienced something else in their life, sport could be a repeated exposure for them, and one instance like that could absolutely set off a chain reaction. When we talk about violence, the largest focus in the literature, in sport, everywhere, is on sexual abuse. And I'll show you data after the next activity on why, I'm not going to say that's not important, but why we need to broaden our focus. Because it's too easy to say, there's one bad apple that's coming into our sport, and we all need to look for them just in case they try and go after a child. That's easy to say because that's a distant idea of a distant person. It's much harder to say what are our own practices, what are we normalizing within the context, what are we not calling out because it's just a little gray. That's a lot harder, and that's where these other topics kind of really lean into. When we talk about sport, actually, when we released some of our research, we were cautioned not to talk too much about some of these topics because the community isn't ready to hear them, which was interesting to me, because I think these are some of the topics we really need to talk about. So these are all examples of abuse in sport that happens. Medical neglect, so that can be things like not giving a child care when they need it. It can also be things like being forced to play while injured or against medical advice. Often people ignore that. Often at the elite level that is touted. That is a strength of character to push through. How many times have we seen players lauded for pushing through an injury at the elite level? And how many kids are watching that? In Australia, our data, just to give some of it away, 30% of the respondents had experienced that type of abuse in community sport as a child in Australia, where they were forced to play against medical advice not to. Context for that. How much did the child want to play? There's a balance there, right? It's not clear cut, and that's the point of policies. That's why there needs to be a very clear cut line for that. So the coach doesn't have to make a decision with the parent going no and the kid going I want to play. It's got to be easy to make the right decision. And the question for you guys is it easy to make that right decision right now? Because there's some things that are quite easy. Again, if we have a story of sexual abuse, that needs to go to the police. That's obvious, like we got to do something. Whether the outcome will be great or not, I don't know. Based on, kind of the media and stuff, we would say no. But it's important to acknowledge like where those lines are and where we go in those instances. Coaching students, that same scenario, said, yeah, it's not really good. And if it was talking to a child, it's definitely wrong. But if it's for elite athletes, that's what you got to do. That's required. That's what's necessary to get to the elite level. By their third year, when they had done all their placements in their various sports, the comments got worse. They were like, oh yeah, I've seen that. That absolutely happens. That's how the coaches talk to the elite athletes. That's what's required if you want to go to elite sport level. And we said, is that okay? Well, yeah, I mean, actually it makes me stronger. Like, I actually like a coach that's really tough on me. I think it makes me perform better. So that's when we pull out the evidence. There's actually no research that has said a controlling, authoritarian coaching style has performance benefits. There's none. There is authoritative coaching styles, structure, rigorous coaching styles that have efficacy, but there's a very difference between a controlling where they're micromanaging phone and social contact and all these, there's a fine line there, but there's no evidence of this abusive level when it crosses into abuse as it's actually got a performance benefit. And I think when you hear all these athletes coming forward post-career, very rarely during career, these elite athletes come forward and say, the time I was on the podium was the worst time of my life. I have never been worse off mentally than I was at the peak. And they talk about their experiences and they talk around it. I don't know if anyone's seen the Beckham documentary. Whew! The spectator abuse was horrendous, and that's categorically easy to see. But I wonder, I was unpacking, and I'm actually writing an article for The Conversation on this, unpacking the parent dynamic. There was a really poignant scene where he was talking, his mom was talking, his dad was talking. And he was talking about how hard his dad was on him. His mom was saying, I really tried to stop him. I tried to step in. And his dad was saying, it's what he needed. It's what made him who he is. And that's the blur. That's the blur, right? And that's the hard bit. And you see that playing out with the coaching students as well. Yeah, so cyber abuse is a very new field, so there's not evidence on the trends over time yet. They're still actually working on tools that can actually measure it appropriately. But what I would say is there's a lot of data coming out that the devices are being used as a controlling mechanism. The devices are being used as something, you hand those over to us, you don't contact your family at training camps. You must respond to your team's thing. You must log this in this app. You must do that. So it's a way to control, and it's a tool, and we've got to accept that new technology comes with new tools, but then we've still got to unpack how we use that. And to be perfectly honest, there's not a lot of research on how that works yet, but absolutely there is a trend that we're seeing more and more of these abusive behaviors are happening through the phone. This next activity, there's no right answer, which is going to annoy everyone. There's no way to win this activity. But there's 7 scenarios on your table, and the way I suggest that you do this is that someone reads out the 7 scenarios, and then your task as a table is to collectively rank them in order of severity. 1 to 7. Think about your why, debate your why. You've got different, I hope maybe different sporting codes or at least different people across your table. 1 is the lowest and 7 is the most severe. And you define what you define as severity. I'm not going to define that word for you. That's up to you and your table.
Frank, 42-year-old shouts and offends the adult players of his team, and the opposing team scores during the cup final.
There are some important takeaways from this. There were a lot of different approaches to how severity was done. Some people said, what's the impact on the child? Some people said, what can my organization most easily handle? That's less severe. And what's the hardest? Some people said, what's the type of abuse? Because there's a hierarchy there. The question I would put to you is not necessarily which is most severe, because all of these are actually abuse. All of them are abuse. Most people across all the workshops have said that the adult abuse is the least severe because they are adults. Not saying that's right or wrong, but technically if that adult is also a victim of domestic violence before, that abuse can be very severe for them. The question isn't really categorically overall, is this type of abuse worse or this experience or situation worse? It can vary completely depending on the person experiencing it. And how you categorize it is less important than you now thinking about Does your club or organization have policies to respond to each of these? Would there be accountability and a clear-cut decision on each of these experiences if they happen in your organization right now? Because often there is for a case of child sexual abuse. That can go up to Sport Integrity Australia straight away if it's against a child, right? If it's physical abuse, it can go straight up to Sport Integrity. There are ways, there are pathways, it's clear-cut as it can be. Data, finally. We did a study in Australia. I don't know how far this reached, but Tasmania was represented in it as well. It was the first study in 20 years to look at experiences of violence against children in Australian sport with a focus on community sport only. We didn't go to ask children directly. There's a lot of ethical limitations around that. That's our next step. We're building the network to be able to do that in a safe and also reportable conduct manner. But we did have a large percentage of people that were in that kind of 18 to 22-year-old range. So speaking to experiences that were less than 1 to 5 years ago in some of those instances. 68 sports, I will never break down that data because the sport doesn't matter. There were no trends or differences across the sports. It's every sport. And this data, by the way, is the same across many different countries. It aligns with what we see internationally in Canada, in Belgium, in the UK. We've used the same tools, we've used the same populations, we get the same numbers. Australia is not unique in this. We're just facing the same battles that every other country is, and we have an opportunity to kind of rise up and lead the space. 76% experienced psychological abuse. Physical abuse was quite high, and then sexual abuse as well. This is one of my favorite images because of the story that is really important to tell. We focus on this. These are the people that have experienced child sexual abuse only. That's a lot of the focus. We focus on that. We focus on grooming behaviors that lead to that. The vast majority of people, 33%, have experienced all 3 types of violence during childhood participation in community sport. There's no way to break down time continuum. There's no way to say those all happened at the same exact time. We just know that they experienced all of them. And so what I would put to you is that the important part of this is that we absolutely need to include that minus 1%. I'm not saying let's ignore sexual abuse by any means, but I'm saying all of these other behaviors, whether they lead to that or not, are happening. And they're what we need to focus on. They're driving away people from sport. They're also the normative culture that's created in sport. Sometimes they're easier to manage, sometimes they're harder. It depends on the culture that's created. But either way, the data is there to show that this is an experience kids are having in sport, and it's something we need to think about. These are the quotes that I didn't include in the first media release because they're a bit iffy. I think this one was included, this one was not. When we break it down, pure psychological violence is the highest. This is the same internationally as well. What hasn't been done before is breaking down coach and parent violence. So looking at 1 in 2 experiencing psychological or physical violence from a coach, those numbers are pretty high. And again, I don't think they speak to a bunch of really bad people in sport. I think they speak to a lot of normative behaviors when you look at what's included. Absolutely, there are some that go way too far, and all of these are considered abuse, so it's not on. But I think there's a lot more we can do to unpack that. When we look at the quotes, there was definitely a large culture of bullying. As a form, it was definitely perceived as hyper-competitiveness. There was a point where it got to, not for me, but for other people in the sport. We heard that a lot, not for me, but for others, reporting for others. It got to the point where a couple of girls ended up in the psych ward for mental breakdowns and stuff like that, to your point on mental health. How do we talk about that? I had to have 18 months off sport because I had to have corrective surgery on my knee, all because the coach, wanted me to play injured in the grand final, and I felt like I had to. The caveat to this, I would say, is what was the kid saying? What were the parents saying at that time too, right? This is this is an adult reflecting on that childhood experience. We don't know all the elements that were in that. Doesn't make it okay. There should have been a policy there that said that's not allowed. But that's the reality. It's a lot more complicated. Want to move into recognizing and responding. So we've kind of already talked about how we recognize diverse types of violence. We've done severity scenarios. We've talked through what it looks like on the ground. But how do we actually respond to it? And I'm going to jump ahead to this one. We've just done a study. It's going to be released nationally in, I think, 2 weeks, pending publication and the media all lined up. We followed up the previous study with a study that looked at how often children disclose any type of violence. So not focus on sexual violence, on everything, and who they disclose to. And did that change based on who they experienced the violence from? So you guys are going to be one of the first 3 workshops to see that data. Tasmania is the first one to see it. But before we get to that, I want to hear what you think. Because this is our biggest challenge, right? We don't all believe necessarily, or I'm speaking to the room that's converted, but a lot of people out there believe that it's not necessarily happening now. It's historical in nature. It's not as widespread as we believe. We have data that suggests otherwise, but it's still hard. So I wonder what you think here. If you go to that QR code, it'll open up a Padlet again, and I'll put that up here. This one, I do want you to go through it individually first and think through what you're thinking individually, but then open up that discussion again. So the first question is, what do you think the barriers are for a child to speak up? And again, not sexual abuse, any instance, any of the examples you've seen, or if you've seen a child come forward to you, or if you know your child has struggled to come forward, what do you think the barriers for that child would be? So barriers for child, there's a list, you can add to that. Barriers for the adults, this is really important from a club perspective, I think, too. What are the barriers you perceive for someone to respond to that? What do they need? What do they know? What do they not know? We'll have discussions at the table with that. And then what does community sport need? This is probably the one I'm personally most interested in because we've got some really interesting responses from the first 2 workshops. We're collating all of this information afterwards as well, like we're having these conversations, but all of this is going up into a Padlet and I'm collating it into the resource pack. So you're going to have what everyone else says as well. We're going to have a key list of recommendations. What do we actually need on the ground to help us move this forward? And those are absolutely going to be leveraged in the media, up to politicians, as far as we can go with it, to try and actually get some momentum and some support at the community sport level. So I'm happy as you're doing that if you want to even discuss together what you think community sport needs to support disclosures. Because again, the goal isn't to have a bunch of disclosures. I mean, most systems are going to be flooded in the first instance when we ask people. Sport Integrity Australia was flooded with calls, mostly historical. The goal is to get recency. The goal is to get people to feel safe to just say, oh, this doesn't feel right. I don't feel good about that. And someone else to say, I believe you, what's next? So how do we get there? What do we need to be at that level where we're receiving them? So in your tables, maybe have a chat. If you feel comfortable sharing, if you know of an instance where you've seen something or a child has come forward, how that happened, did it unfold in the way you expected? Now's the chance to kind of share stories across how you think your organization would or has responded to this. What could be better? Because these are really important discussions to have, especially across codes. For the disclosure data, just to run through some high level, because I think it is important to have a broader understanding, what we saw was when people experience peer violence, only 1 in 3 would ever speak to an adult about it. So we only focused on if they spoke to an adult, because an adult, we felt like, has a responsibility to act. There is a lot of peer-to-peer disclosure that absolutely happens. It's something to consider within clubs if there's an avenue for peers to disclose about other peers experiencing abuse or what they witness, or if that can be anonymized. I think there's a place for thinking about those mechanisms. But here we actually focused on if they told an adult. So 1 in 3 who experienced peer violence, about 1 in 4 who had spoke coach violence, and for those who experienced violence from a parent, about 1 in 10. And when you look at the next data, that all kind of makes sense because the number 1 person the adult went to is the parent. They were allowed to select multiple responses here as to who they went to, but the major feedback was parents are almost always the first responder in these instances. Yet most club policies require at some point a disclosure to go through a formal reporting process within the club. And what we found was that girls were a lot less likely to ever speak to someone in a club about their experience. So that's an interesting gender dynamic that we have at play there. And this isn't conclusive, right? It's a sample. There needs to be more research done on this, so we can't holistically say it. But it does look like there's a gender difference in who they're willing to go to. But categorically, parents were first. So then we think, okay, parents are receiving the disclosures. How do we help them know clearly, this is violence, you need to go to the club. You need to go through this reporting process. The policy process generally expects that someone experiences violence, discloses to an adult, and this isn't just in sport, this is everywhere. It goes to a formal report and the violence stops. When we did our interviews with it's a pretty little process, right? Very linear. When we did our interviews with individuals in community sport, what we found was there were kind of 2 processes. One internal one, just as you guys said, where they weighed up, is this normal? Is this happening to everyone around me? So it's probably not bad enough. What's the consequences of speaking out? And they didn't just think about for them. They thought, what if I told on my dad's friend? Like they were already thinking out to that level, like what are the consequences to that person? I could ruin their whole career. Is this really bad enough that I ruin their whole, like that's what they're debating through, right? That's some heavy stuff they're dealing with, and most people just stayed there for quite a while. And they said, oh, I experienced like repeated violence for a long time before I ever realized that it was bad enough. And usually what drove the bad enough was them realizing that they wanted to be able to wake up on a Sunday morning, hop in the car and go play a game of soccer or rugby without worrying about if someone was going to try and hurt me. I just wanted to have fun. I just wanted it to go back to the way it was. That was the repeated thing. Even with the disclosures when they did, they would talk about it just not being fun anymore. And I heard myself saying that at the start, and I hadn't actually just connected that, but that's actually what I said as well, like what I realized in college. I was like, this isn't fun anymore. Why am I doing this to myself? But I was an adult at that point too, and it was still tricky to make that call. When I was 16 or 17, I had a coach who would throw equipment out of frustration. He had a clipboard. He would like to stand up and throw it on the ground or break it, slap it around. He kind of introduced himself saying that was how he behaved, and it was almost like he thought it was acceptable behavior at junior level sport. Normalizing it from the start. This is what to expect. There were parents in the room as well. No one said anything, and the kid said, well, no one said anything, so that's what it is, right? So that person's not going to come forward about that experience. When they did come forward, the response by the adult very rarely ever led to an actual formal report. The response was typically something that was normalizing, rationalizing, or in the worst instances, dismissing. And I don't say this to villainize all parents, because I think a lot of it is them realizing you don't want to go through that process. You don't want to speak up. So in some ways, parents might do that. They also might kind of rationalize it in the sense of making the child feel better, because actually when things are normalized, there's immediate relief. If you say, oh, this happened, it was really terrible, and someone else says, oh, me too, you feel this sense of solidarity and relief. And when it's a parent saying it to you, and it can actually feel comforting in the short term. You actually feel like, whew, all right, maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was. I've told someone it's okay. The problem with that is in the long term is it sends them back into the cycle of abuse. It doesn't actually change anything in the system. You're sending the child like, oh, you can do it, just go back in and try again. Acutely, the child feels better, they feel relieved, but in the long term, it's not changed any of the processes in the system. It hasn't gotten to anything formal. There's nothing recorded, nothing changes. The system just continues. The parents' perception was the coach was being unfair when the girls were kind of excluding some of us, but their perception of the coach throwing the clipboard or equipment around and getting angry, they weren't worried about that. So there was a normalization by the parents based on the type of violence. And that's based on, I think, as you were saying, like what they experienced growing up. It's like, oh, well, that's normal. I don't think I ever had a coach that didn't throw stuff at me. Like towards, around, but it was to fire us up, right? That was the mentality. And we all felt like that's what it was. And that was the message that was thrown to us, right? Like, so you get that idea that that's just what it is. And that's part of the challenge. Especially my soccer coach, I used to tell him things, even if they were just little things. I put little things with a caveat that it was psychological violence. That was little things. It's absolutely not little. And he basically told me to suck it up and get over it. That kid's never going back to that coach, and possibly never going back to another person. If that coach was the one they trusted and that was destroyed, that's a challenge. So the next few slides are going to be kind of some takeaways from me on different topics of what we can do now. I don't think I'm going to give you information on a trauma-informed response in the next 2 minutes, but I do just want to make you aware that this is really important, and it's a field that's just starting. It's just starting in the mental health sector, like how to give a trauma-informed response. There are just starting to be resources for this. This is taken from one that I've undertaken from Phoenix, Australia. When you think about it, kind of some key takeaways from this in terms of responding to disclosures are you want to minimize barriers as much as possible. Make it as easy as possible for someone to tell their story, and make sure they only have to tell it as few times as required. How do you make it so when they tell the first person a system is in place? Think about how many people it takes to action something. That's important from a systems perspective, because if a child comes forward, it takes the parent, then the parent going to the member protection officer maybe doesn't know quite whether they should do something. So maybe they go to the SSO, maybe they go to the NSO, maybe they go to SIA. How many people does that have to go through? And how many times does each person have to say, yeah, that's bad enough, keep going? So where are those breakdowns? And how many times is the child or the parent having to rehash that story? So you want to minimize harms from the system. That can be such practical things as, things we've talked about, transparency of procedures, like what happens next. Not just in terms of in the background for the club, but what happens for the child, what's told to them. Give them the reality of what's about to unfold. Give the parents the reality of how long is it going to take. Those are the things they want to know, right? They're telling you, but then they still care. They want to know what's going to happen next. Think about collaborating with other services. Sport often acts in a silo, partly by design, especially at the elite level, I think, to kind of keep everything in-house, but partly because that's the way it's always been done. But there are services out there, there are mental health use services that are fantastic, that are free to access. Do your clubs reference those when people come forward about abusive experiences? Do you have something you can give someone that they can go to? Do you know the local urgent care if someone has a concussion injury and of course you don't have a medical doctor on site to triage the person right there? Do you know where to refer them to? It's not your responsibility necessarily to follow up all that care after they leave the field, but I think it's something that we can do if we partner with services, and I say partner in a loose term in terms of just knowing what they do and knowing what we do and how to get people over there. There's some opportunities there that don't cost money. They take time and resources, obviously, but they don't necessarily cost a club monetary money. And then have support for the responders as well. Think about the people hearing these stories because it can be quite heavy. So some things you can do today, there are checklists, there are Safe Sporting Club resources on Play by the Rules, also on Sport Integrity Australia. Those are an excellent starting point. A lot of them kind of are absolutely tick boxing just to get you the bare minimum. But we've had these conversations as a starting point today, which hopefully get you thinking about all the gray. So these aren't necessarily going to answer the gray, but you've been thinking about the gray. So go beyond those checklists. Think about the consequences because other people are thinking about if there are consequences or not. And if they're not, why are they going to change the behavior? It's a lot of work to change behavior. Would you feel confident, and I'm going to move beyond you, would you feel confident in the volunteers at your organization feeling confident in receiving and responding to disclosures of the examples we've given you today? So how do we support them? Do they have someone they can go to? And that's always going to be the case. Maybe some people are never going to feel completely comfortable in that role. Maybe they don't need that specific role. Maybe they just need to know who to go to. And there are triaging services. SIA has a hotline that you can call, and they actually help walk you through what's mandatory reportable conduct. The gray gets in when they say, oh yeah, not bad enough to go to the police, so back to you. And when it comes back to you, do you know what to do? Some ideas I'm going to leave you with. Consider how the idea of an ethos of competition is discussed in the club. Consider how it's centered. What are the drivers in your club? Where do you place fun and enjoyment in those social elements, and where is competition? Remember your role and the power you have. I think this group is having some really good conversations about power hierarchies and who has the power in scenarios. As a junior teacher, when I first started 10 years ago, I often felt like I was just one of the other students. I was just them a year ago. And I didn't realize how much authority I immediately had by stepping in the room as a teacher. And I think it's important still now to think every time you step into a room, the power hierarchy that exists there. And power, and hierarchical power, is one of the challenges in terms of preventing violence. And to that point, I want to drop down to review where the power rests within the club and where and how you provide children a voice. How do they speak up in your club? Do you have children on your board? Do you have a youth advisory committee? Why not? There are youth advisory committees everywhere. There are actually training programs for kids to go up on company boards now in various organizations. The government is doing this. You can have a parent come alongside them. There's a way to do that safely. They are your major stakeholder. Have them in the room, but not have it just be a survey to find out what they think and what they want. Have it be meaningful. Let them have a voice. Let them have a seat at the table. Give them that power, because when we're talking about behavior change and creating a different kind of environment, they can help you lead that. They can tell you on the ground what's happening. And then the last point is consider kind of elements such as anonymous reporting streams. I did this in teaching, and it transformed the way I taught. Ask for feedback at the end of the course, great. It's great to know at the end what happened and what went wrong, but I actually give them a Padlet very much like what you saw there and let them write anything they were struggling with on there. And all of a sudden I found out all the challenges that my students were facing, not just about my teaching, but just in life in general. It was all anonymous. They felt free to share it. It doesn't mean that it will allow you to transform everything. It doesn't mean that it will allow you to investigate everything, but you might get a sense of kind of a barometer of where things are heading in your club. You might be able to address some things as a team, as an organization, without having to go down an individual route. It doesn't answer all the questions. It's just a different way of looking at things. How to convince on the importance value. You guys are converted. You're here. You came here. You broadly knew what we were going to talk about. Maybe not all the details. Maybe not the level that we would go to. What I would suggest is that when you're trying to convince people, you think there are 3 categories of people. The people who already believe you, good. The people in the middle ground who absolutely can be swayed, that's a good majority. Then there are the people that are not going to be convinced. There's going to be a group of people that we have to exit out of the system. I'm not saying that's the majority, but there are going to be some who are just not going to want to change. The best way that I've found to convince people that something is a normalized violent behavior is to take them out of sport. I tell them, so you don't think that throwing a clipboard at a child is bad? What if a teacher threw a book at a child? Oh, no, you can't do that. Okay. What if a parent came up and screamed at your kid on the playground because they weren't hitting the ball fast enough or they weren't doing this right or whatever? Would that be okay? No, absolutely not. Then why can a coach do that? Why is it okay in that specific setting? Well, it's performance, they need a tough love. There's no evidence out there that tough love mentality has any positive impacts on performance, and there's a lot of evidence to show that it has negative impacts on mental well-being. But taking yourself out of the sport environment and giving examples that are very similar, but just in a different context, is a good way to get people thinking of, am I normalizing that? That's also how I can kind of speak to some of the students on their behaviors. The last thing, and I know you're tired, so I know it's hard for me to ask you to do one more thing, but from a researcher perspective, I don't think everything is going to change from you doing a post-survey. I don't think that everything changed in the last hour and a half. I'm mostly interested about the last couple questions, and this is important. There are 2 questions that ask if you want to include your email, which will automatically be removed from your data, so it won't be attached. They're for 2 reasons. Not to know who said what, but the first is that I'm collating everything. Over the next 3.5, 4 weeks, I'm putting everything together and I'm developing a resource pack. You'll have links to all the relevant resources that you suggest you might need that already exist, either internationally or here. There is actually an international group that I work with that has developed all these resources for how to facilitate some of the activities that we did today in your own club. There's also free resources where you can facilitate it with youth. And it's actually physical activities where they have to run to different sides and talk about how comfortable they are in each other's personal spaces. So if you put your email in there, then I'm allowed to contact you and send you that information, which I would like to do. There's a secondary option, which is that we're constantly doing research and we're constantly trying to get community perspectives, diverse perspectives. And if you want to be contacted in the future to lend your voice to that anonymously, obviously, then there'll be diverse opportunities and we're happy to email you when they come out if you want to know about that. There's no pressure on that at all. But I also know that a lot of people want to speak up and say, hey, this is what's happening, and they just don't have an opportunity. So that's an opportunity for that. So I'm going to leave you guys with that. That's all I have for you today. That should take you 3 to 4 minutes. You will have the slides from this. That's not an issue. We will have more resources for you guys. I do just want to end with acknowledging it's a hard conversation. There are all these services as well. Some of them are Victoria in nature just because this is what I generally use for Victoria, but most of them are national organizations as well. So things like this are what I will include for resources in the resource pack as well. Very happy to talk with you guys individually. I don't know how long we have the space for Tom, but you won't be rushed out of here necessarily. But that's all I have for you. And I just want to first thank everyone for your involvement and your generous time and giving your ideas and input to this workshop. It's so important, and we are part of the change just by being here today. So, thank you.